Welcome.
Lead balloons.
It's the alchemy of
Unpopular opinions. So,
Whoops, I have somewhere to be. There's actually bourbon in this, so everyone knows.
those things are very complicated and
I don't know that I actually believe what I'm about to say.
spreading lies.
This critical culture that we live in.
Just to try to be an asshole.
Hey, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Joel, how are you tonight?
Man, I'm fantastical.
Love it. Love the AL ending there. Okay, we're gonna dive in tonight. A very exciting favorite books episode on one of Joel's favorite books, The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. Before we get going, Joel, let's talk to people about how they can connect with us at different outlets for connecting with us in this podcast.
Yeah, hop on that World Wide Web of yours and go to www.leadballoonspod.com. You're going to see all the icons for all the audio links where you can listen to that. You can go to our YouTube and channel, check that out. And while you're doing that, do us a favor. Subscribe, like, leave a comment, especially to our YouTube. If you guys go over there, if you haven't done so already, hit a subscribe button there. Likes, comments, all that kind of stuff is really helpful for us as we're trying to reach more and more people. And then also, if you guys got any comments or requests for topics for Trent and I to discuss, you can email us at leadballoonspodcast at the CAST at gmail.com, and we will happily respond to that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so we're talking about tonight The Great Divorce. No, not about marriage per se, but just divorce in terms of separation. But written by C.S. Lewis, who is just this colossal, enormous character in probably still to this day in evangelicalism. Joel, why do so many evangelicals and Christians in general just adore C.S. Lewis? What do you think the draw is there?
I'm going to give 3 reasons. One is he's so fucking quotable. He knows how to turn a phrase in a short amount of time. Kind of a G.K. Chesterton kind of writer, and you can just pick out lines that Christians just love to, like, quote pastors. Pastors are the inseminators, right? of all of the information, and Lewis can work his way into a sermon quite easily. Second is Chronicles of Narnia, this very famous series that like went viral across Christendom. But I think why he's so in particularly loved by evangelicals is because the way he engaged his writings was very almost a defense of Christianity. He was defending Christianity against the intellectuals of his day, so he's got a real apologetics kind of flavor to his writings, and that's catnip for most evangelical Christians. Like, how can I make what this crazy stuff I believe sound more legitimate to intellectuals? Clive Staple Lewis.
Jack Lewis, if you know him well.
Me and Jack.
One of my favorite memories, I don't think I've ever told you this, but had a seminary professor. Lewis he's tough for people because he had some funky views, right? And we'll delve into some of that. But I remember one of my seminary professors when I was at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I had one professor after class, we were talking about like C.S. Lewis, and he goes, well, so Lewis didn't believe in substitutionary atonement, and so he's not a believer.
I know.
Just kind of dismissively, just like. So
is he the same guy that said that Mother Teresa was burning in hell? Is that the same professor?
No, but I mean, yeah, right. But the problem some people have with it is they want to embrace him so much because he says so many wonderful things, and he's such a great resource for Christians, and particularly with the project of Christian apologetics or defending the faith. But for those who are conservative evangelicals, there were things that he said that would make you think he's a heretic.
And basically, I would argue that he's almost a universalist in the way that he talks about things, and that shit doesn't fly with Christians. That you will burn like Rob Bell for that stuff.
Ooh, you do not want that. All right, so the book starts, as many books do, with a preface. And I want to read, this is a somewhat extended quote. I don't think it's that long, but worth quoting. I want to read this excerpt, and then I ask you a question about it.
Sure.
So Lewis writes this in the preface of Blake wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If I've written of their divorce, this is not because I think myself a fit antagonist for so great a genius, nor even because I feel at all sure that I know what he meant. But in some sense or other, the attempt to make that marriage is perennial. The attempt is based on the belief that reality never presents us with an absolutely unavoidable either-or. That granted skill and patience, and above all time enough, some way of embracing both alternatives can always be found. That mere development or adjustment or refinement will somehow turn evil into good without our being called on for a final and total rejection of anything we should like to retain. This belief I take to be a disastrous error. You cannot take all luggage with you on all journeys. On one journey, even your right hand and your right eye may be among the things you have to leave behind. Joel, could you recall how reading these words for the first time moved you? Were you hooked right then and there reading this part of the preface, or was it a slow burn? Did it happen later on in this book?
It happened later on. I probably read this book. I mean, for many years, I read this at least once a year. So I've probably read this book 30 times. And the first time I read it, it was an assignment for an introductory theology class. I think it was for a research writing, paper class, basically on how to write research papers. And this was the book assigned to us. And so I remember reading this book and having to pull out my dictionary multiple times to go like, what does that word mean? And so I'm this, 19-year-old kid reading, probably for the first time in my life, someone who is a more eloquent writer. This is not Michael Crichton that I'm reading right now. So when I read that, I had no idea who Blake was. It took me a long time to understand who even he was. But as I look back on it, I think the things that I love that he probably back then I was like, oh, I know that Jesus talked about the right hand, the right eye, and cutting that off. But as I grew an understanding of what he was saying in this preface, I think what was really attractive to me during those days to, early 20s Joel was this real argument that you got to choose one or the other. We can't like buffet style life. And I really liked that at the time because I thought that was a really hearing that coming from an intellectual person arguing that, hey, we got to choose something. We can't just kind of like stand back and go like, hey, everything's just nice and dandy and I'm going to pick a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I was like, no. Like what system are you really like leaning into? And that's what I think he was semi saying there is that you can't just, and I'll hit a quote later here where he kind of talks about that too, but he's arguing here already right out of the gate that some things are just errors and we need to dismiss them. And that's what I think his book is trying to highlight. The difference between heaven and hell is a great divorce. There's a massive chasm between the two, and you cannot do both.
Interesting. Yeah. I think something we'll come back to as well that's interesting about the way you describe your encounter with the book is it caught you at a very particular time in life when you were impressionable, at least for this. It meant something to you. You needed it at that time. It was a time of, and that's probably true. A lot of the books that end up on our favorites list is they came along at an appropriate time. If it would have come earlier or later, it may not have had the same impact. But hearing somebody who could speak so eloquently and have street cred as a real academic was, I think, meaningful for you then. I know at that time in my life when I had read the Chronicles of Narnia and stuff, but then when I really delved more deeply into C.S. Lewis, it meant quite a bit at that time for me, sure. Okay, well, did you have anything else to say about that before we move on, Joel?
No, I will highlight that just real quick, that yes, this book hit me at a very particular point in my life. It was the beginning of my theological journey. I'd never heard heaven or hell, which were very strong narratives in my faith tradition. They were very distinct. You talked about them in very specific ways as reward and punishment, and they had very literal definitions of what they would be like. And I'd never heard anyone even remotely begin to like tinker with descriptions and details. And here he reimagines the whole fucking thing. He reimagines all of it. There's no fire. There's no brimstone. There's no angels with harps. There's none of this. It's this completely different story. And I had never encountered anything like that. And I was telling my my wife Poonam about this podcast. It's like, yeah, we're going back to this book. And it's interesting. I still call it my favorite book, but even though I don't really agree with it theologically in the same ways I used to. And she's like, that's so interesting. Why do you still call it your favorite book? Haven't you read any other books like that? And I was like, no, I don't think I have. I think I was invited into this world through this book, and no other book has done that for me in that same way, largely because I'm now in the world of that this book opened me up to, and you can only really break that seal once, and that's kind of what this book did for me.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so let's tell people who aren't familiar with the book a little bit more about it. I'll start, and then you'll give Phil out a little bit more. But it was published in 1945, and it describes a kind of a dreamlike journey in which the narrator boards a bus, and it takes him to a land where he and his fellow passengers, as he will then thereafter refer to as like ghosts, a land where he and his fellow passengers encounter solid people, and a land that is more real and solid than he and his fellows. Joel, why don't you take it from here, and if you could give us a kind of a brief summary of the book's main plot, and then also follow up by answering the question of what influenced Lewis to write this, and what do you think he was trying to achieve in the book? So start off kind of giving us a rundown of the plot.
So the plot starts with this group of people that are all squabbling down in this very misty town, which we later refer to as Greytown. Spoiler alert, it's a metaphor for hell. And everyone is grumpy. Everyone's, there's no like violence other than some punching and here and there, but there's not like pitchforks and torture. It's more just boring misery everywhere, and no one gets along, and there's always rain and mist, and they board this bus that's vibrant in color, and they're riding on it, and then they find themselves in the air, and the whole trip up, the narrator, which is C.S. Lewis, is having conversations with people who are all just disgruntled beings of some ilk or form. Some are very intellectual, some are very commoner kinds of folks, but they all are just disgruntled with life. And they get up to this world, and it's bright. Again, this is a metaphor for heaven, and everything is so real and solid that it makes what felt solid in hell look transparent, and these become the ghosts. And what you find is in this world, the grass is so real it stabs their feet as ghosts. The leaves are so real that they're too heavy for the narrator C.S. Lewis to even pick up, because it's so real compared to these transparent ghosts from Greytown. And what you find is these beings of light, travel from the mountains, the deep mountains, which is another metaphor that Lewis uses for heaven, also in the Chronicles of Narnia, further in, right?
Further in.
Yeah, to the mountains of heaven. And these beings are coming back with a specific task to try and convince these ghosts to stay in heaven. And one by one, all of these ghosts come up with their laundry list of reasons why they would rather, and I think here he quotes Milton, where they'd rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. And so that's really what Lewis is painting a picture of here. He's painting a picture of the difference between heaven and hell as this very like almost translucent, meaningless drivel of hell, and what is real and bright and joy in heaven, and the contrast. And I'll read a quote from the preface as to why I think he wrote this and what he was trying to achieve, and it kind of touches on what you read. And he writes, and this is another semi-long quote, I do not think all who choose wrong roads perish, but their rescue consists in being put back on the right road. A sum, I always loved this line, a sum cannot be put right, but only by going back till you find the error and working it afresh from that point, never by simply going on. Evil can be undone, but it cannot develop into good. Time does not heal it. The spell must be unwound, bit by bit, with backward mutters of dissevering power, or else not. It is still either or. If we insist on keeping hell, or even earth, we shall not see heaven. If we accept heaven, we shall not be able to retain even the smallest and most intimate souvenirs of hell. And what I think he's trying to paint here is a very stark contrast. He's arguing that when we're talking about spiritual matters of life, that there is a dividing line between what is truly good and what is truly evil.
Yeah, I want to comment on that for a second. I think that on one level it works. I mean, Lewis is a master of analogies. I think his analogies, that's one thing when I started reading him, especially reading his like nonfiction, I was so drawn to. But they do have their limitations. Funny he chooses a mathematical analogy. I mean, you could also if you chose a biological analogy, it might work out differently. For example, I remember reading a book by George Eliot, the author, I think the 19th century author George Eliot, a book called The Mill on the Floss. And there's this scene where there's this huge like flood and it like destroys everything. And the opening line of the next chapter is nature repairs her ravages.
Yeah.
And it kind of that is implied that time, like when the body is wounded, it's time that heals it. Obviously, There's mechanisms involved, but I think it's interesting he chooses that analogy. That's certainly true with mathematics. That you don't just keep going forward. You have to go back and fix the point where there was a problem. So it's very effective. But thought I'd throw that in.
I wanted to jump in there. If you read the preface, he actually uses that analogy a little bit earlier as the point to that not every, reality is not all concentric circles pointing to the truth. He says, even in biology, it's less like a river and more like a tree that is branching out into diverse and diverse and diverse, not just between diverse of good and bad, but diverse in different kinds of good. And so he does acknowledge that, but then he brings that back to the mathematical to make his point. And again, like you just did, we can look at this in a different way and challenge his point, but he's very gifted at making his point. Yeah.
Yeah, I would not have wanted to debate him, that's for sure. He's a shredder. Okay. All right. We're going to talk about, every book has like its standout moments, and for our favorite books, there are many standout moments, but let me talk about my experience with the book just very briefly. I read the book probably for the first time. It had to have been in my 20s. That would be my guess. Think after college. And I remember I loved the book too. When I read it, I mean, I was really into Christianity at the time, and it was very big, especially one of the hangups that I always had with Christianity was the doctrine of hell. And this it was a reflection on hell that was, it was inspired by a biblical imagination, but it took more liberties, and it seemed somewhat hopeful. It seemed somewhat gentle. And it was it was very meaningful to me, extremely meaningful to me at the time. And I remember, I probably read the book maybe at least once, but maybe twice. And so in preparation for this, I went back and read maybe a third of it and then kind of caught some of the Cliff Notes versions of it. But there was one passage that I thought was, again, pretty intriguing. It's when the narrator meets up with George MacDonald, who was one of Lewis's like heroes and mentors, the author who had preceded him, George MacDonald. And so MacDonald here is critiquing what I might call curiosity for curiosity's sake, curiosity with no substance, and so so MacDonald says, there have been men before now who got so interested in proving the existence of God that they came to care nothing for God himself, as if the good Lord had nothing to do but exist. There have been some who were so occupied in spreading Christianity that they never gave a thought to Christ. Man, you see it in smaller matters. Did you never know a lover of books that with all his first editions and signed copies had lost the power to read them? Or an organizer of charities that had lost all love for the poor? It reminds me of there was I think it was a John Stott, the late John Stott, a quote from him where he says, love for humanity in general may be an excuse for not loving anybody in particular. It's sort of like these people who have all these programs, but they never actually get down to doing. It reminds me of a buddy of mine. We were having a discussion, and it was like one of his in-laws was talking about how he taught. He's like, "Oh yeah, and I teach this class, and I have all these techniques, and I teach my students this, and it's this like time organization, da da da." And my buddy was like, "So you practice this yourself?" And the in-law was like, "Well, I teach it. You see, I teach it." It was like, no, he didn't do it. He just taught it. There are those for those who. So anyway, I love the quote in terms of sort of like they can't get to the substance of the thing. It would always be a run-up forever, for eternity. You would never be getting to the thing.
It's such a beautiful challenge. And George MacDonald, for those out there who have not encountered this Scottish preacher, like brilliant writer who inspired Lewis. Lewis always called George MacDonald his master, and he makes him the mentor here, leading him in heaven. And his if you listen to the audiobooks, they do all of his voices in a Scottish accent. It's just it's delicious. It's so great. But what I love about that passage you just read was that it's a call out on just a very human thing, that we can have the veneer of godliness and be so far from it. Our ego is slippery. And what I really see in this book is what it looks like to have all these egoic veneers, and all these people coming up from Greytown with their, again, laundry list of excuses of why they would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, and how none of that matters in heaven. And you have just unfettered joy and lack of pretense and lack of need to prove oneself from these beings of light. And it's such a beautiful contrast.
Well, would you share an excerpt that for you exemplifies the book's power?
Sure. This might take me a little bit to tell, so give me a little bit of time here. I'm gonna set it up. So there's multiple vignettes throughout the book, encounters between beings of light coming to try and convince these people to stay. It might be a husband and a wife. It might be I'm trying to think some other encounters. There you have some intellectual peers, academicians that are talking. And one is this woman, and it starts off with this woman who's being paraded in heaven, and Lewis is standing there with MacDonald, and they're watching like this parade of children and adults and animals and angels, and they're singing, and the language in it is so beautiful. If I can just find it real quick, what he says about her. I did my best to try and highlight some of this stuff. So this woman is coming down, and what Lewis says of her as he's like watching her come is, if she were naked, that must have been the most visible penumbra of her courtesy and joy, which produced in my memory the illusion of a great and shining train that followed her across the happy grass. Like this being of light, if she were naked, I didn't see it because there was this aura of joy about her. It just like was like creating, and it was such a beautiful language. And MacDonald's is like, she's one of the great ones. And Lewis is like, well, who is she? Who is she? He's like, oh, you wouldn't know her on Earth. Like the great ones up here are not the same as the great ones on Earth. She's this humble woman to whom and I'm going to read some of this. To every child, she was a mother. She was a father. Because Lewis says she must have had a very large family. And he says, no, every boy or every girl that she met, she became a mother to. And then, isn't that a bit hard on their own parents, says Lewis. And then MacDonald says, no, there are those who steal other people's children. But her motherhood was of a different kind. Those on whom it fell went back to their natural parents, loving them more. Few men looked on her without becoming, in a certain fashion, her lovers. But it was the kind of love that made her not less true, but truer to their own wives. So here's this woman who loved every cat, loved every dog, loved all these people, and she's being paraded through heaven, and she meets up with her former husband, who had come up from Greytown, and he is envisioned as a small dwarf. Remember the ghost, and he has a chain that goes up and shackles around this Trajan, this thespian of a person, this kind of old actor from London, sort of, and that actor is kind of the persona of this former husband, and they have just this conversation, and she keeps talking to the small dwarf that this is her husband, but it's the Trajan that keeps talking and giving all this, like, didn't you miss me? And she's like, oh, don't worry about that here. Don't worry about that. None of that matters here. Stay. And he's like, what, you didn't love me? Of course. I love you. Anything I've ever done wrong, please forgive me. Oh, we don't need to talk about that. But what about love? What do you know of love? And it's just like this really pretentious conversation from the Trajan, and her just like looking down at the dwarf going like, I'm talking to you. Like, stop this. You don't need to act this way anymore. And one of my favorite parts there is the dwarf starts to shrink and it utterly disappears, and the chain disappears into to the thespian, and then she looks around and goes like, where'd my husband go? Okay, and then she walks off as if to say there's no more hope here. He's completely said no to this opportunity to stay in heaven. And Lewis, who's watching this with MacDonald, says, why didn't she try harder? She could have gone down into the chasm, into Greytown, and like tried to rescue him. And he says, where would you have her go? And he says, to go down into hell. We came up this huge chasm in this bus. And he says, and MacDonald picks up a piece of grass and says, look, I cannot be certain that this is the crack you came up through, but through a crack no bigger than ye certainly came.
Wow,
and he begins to just say, like, hell is so small and insignificant compared to heaven, basically, that she couldn't even fit down there, that no molecule of heaven would overwhelm hell. And it's such a beautiful, like, imagery.
When you share that, see, that's in rereading this, and obviously I didn't read it all, so I didn't catch that story, but you remind me of a reaction now that I remember having when I read that, because I was thinking a lot about like heaven and hell, and I was thinking that at least at that time in my life, that there are people who just refuse joy and love. They can't receive it and they can't give it. And I felt like reading this, I thought, yes, those people, they become smaller and smaller. They cave inward and they stop reaching out to other people, and they do move farther and farther away. But love is this boundless quality. It's in limitless supply. You can't sort of like run out of love. The more you give, the more you get, and you can keep giving more. It's just like the loaves just keep multiplying with love. And I thought,
a biblical reference.
That was intentional. Footnote given. And so, yeah, that there is a smallness. I think that concept, smallness, is very fascinating.
Yeah, the first line of the last chapter, he says, I do not know that I ever saw anything more terrible than the struggle of that dwarf ghost against joy.
Wow. Yeah. Yep. So let's take it on a personal level, as we've done with previous favorite book episodes. Joel, tell us when you read this book and read it multiple times. How did you? What was it about it that affected you so powerfully? Okay, and then how does it affect you now? You've changed as a person. Some of your theological views have changed. Talk about the evolution of this.
So, does it affect me in the same way? I have to say yes and no. Because I went back and I haven't read this in maybe 4 years. And I went back and read through a lot of it. And it still like conjures feelings, and it still impacts me in ways of like, wow, what a great way to say that. The imagination, the eloquence, the turn of phrase, the very earthy depictions of human beings exercising their egos. These little vignettes capture a lot of the human condition in very mundane, commonplace ways. Slippery ways, things that you would not see as dramatic, but like a mother's love. There's one where a mother's talking with her husband and she wants to see her son who died early, and it's her love for her son, but really her love would rather bring her son back down to be with her in hell than, and she just there's a lot of self-pity from the ghosts that you see in a lot of these playing the victims, and it's so powerful the way that he talks about all that. But it doesn't impact me in the same way it used to, largely because I have evolved in a lot of the ways that I view heaven and hell. Personally, I don't see heaven and hell as destinations after death. And I haven't for a long time, even while I was still a pastor. That was kind of like one of those things that I personally held, though I didn't speak explicitly about that when I would preach sermons. I would just speak in ways that try to help people zoom out a bit from these doctrines and help them see heaven and hell as metaphors. I think the Jewish scriptures intentionally communicated them in that way. So I would try to help people see them that way. But today I see them as metaphors that reflect current reality. Hell is not a punishment for sin. Evil punishes the sinner in real time. That's what hell is. Evil punishes the sinner in real time. We experience the consequences of hell in our in the things that we do. When I choose unkindness or to not lean into love, I have to experience the consequences of that choice, and it is in one way to say it, hell. Heaven is not a reward for being good. Goodness grants its own reward. The experience of heaven, as Jesus would talk about, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. That's why I would kind of talk about it in those ways. The idea that there's like some weird spectrum that has black on one side and white on one side, and somewhere in that gray area, God drew a line and says, you are all going to be eternally rewarded and you are all going to be eternally punished. It's just nonsense. It makes no sense to me that a deity would do it that way, and that, as evangelicals would say, oh, what separates that big line? It doesn't matter how awful a person you are or how good of a person you are. Did you say this prayer? That's what it's like, the smallest price anyone can possibly pay to go to heaven. And so that is very different to me. I don't see it in those ways. This book does not justify or prop up a bunch of doctrines that I was taught, but it does still tickle the imagination in ways that I think is fun and enjoyable.
Is there also an aspect of is it a nostalgia like as well for you, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I can't not be the person who believed all these things and grew in this soil. I don't want to reject that part of me. That part of me will always be with me, even though I may see things differently now.
Yeah. It's because one of the reasons I asked that question, so I want to get to sort of my reaction to the book. I think that this is again being illustrated to me that one of the differences between you and me is even 20 years ago, my sort of sheep and the goats understanding of reality was so at 10 on the volume. I mean, it was so intense.
This one goes to 11.
Oh man, it was so intense, and so the book meant so much to me because of that. Mm-hmm. And now that I've gone totally away from that, the book just doesn't work for me anymore.
Sure.
And it's because of those. It's because of how intensely I thought about that then, and also how intensely I think about it now. So here's what I think about the book. As I already shared, I really loved it in my 20s. And when I picked it up and read some of it, granted, I didn't get all the way through, and would have affected, like the passage you just shared about the lady and her husband and the dwarf situation, like that. I actually found that to be quite powerful. But honestly, I did not like the book at all reading it, and I'll say for a couple reasons. One is from a theological perspective. I think that here Lewis is being maybe a little bit disingenuous, because he prefaces his book with basically saying it's a dream, and then in the it's just speculation, right? And in the book he even refers to, like, George MacDonald's like, make sure that you tell people like this is a dream, But you'd have to be denying reality and not know that a lot of people are looking to you as sort of you're not just telling a story that's kind of fun. Like, people are reading your stuff and sort of getting clues on what might be true. And I think that it was good for Lewis in the sense that it was an exploration of deeper truths about heaven and hell. But I think that he was also wanting people maybe to take it more seriously than just a story. And so I didn't love that. The other thing I think that I didn't love, we've had the allegory discussion before, and I just don't think my palate agrees with allegory that much, because I felt like, Lewis, is this something you could have written an essay about? You could have, and instead you turned it into a story. And I just felt like it was a little bit too stilted, that some of the characters were more like ideas and more like kind of a simple illustration of a certain situation, and didn't have that organic quality to them. That kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And I think also, like you were talking about just now, kind of talking about like heaven and hell, and how we can sort of earthify those concepts, if I can say it that way. Well, but one of the problems is there's like the situation of the deathbed conversion, or like the serial killer conversion, right? And it seems like in this story, although he's not describing those exactly, like he kind of is okay with that. The understanding of grace reaches out to the person who asks for it. But then there's, and sort of Christianity would subscribe. They would basically say you're saved by grace alone through faith alone. So if you make a deathbed conversion, you're in. But then Lewis would also be the kind of person who would support the notion, and you see some of this in the last battle with like the character or the god Tash, or the character who's sort of like almost Christian because they were moving in the they were well intentioned.
Aslan says to him, "Your service to Tash I take unto me."
And so like he seems to support the idea that like the righteousness that you live out, irrespective of getting the faith part right, can be meaningful. And it's just like making those two work together. I just have never been able to make those fit. So theologically, it really doesn't work for me. And at the level of literature, it bothers me that that's a little too heavy-handed. It didn't quite work for me that way. It left me feeling like that I definitely preferred Chronicles of Narnia to this, and I also prefer his nonfiction to this. Yeah. So that's my take. I don't want to rain on a parade, Joel. I celebrate your your love
there's
of it.
There's a bit of a tropisms, right, with those vignettes that he's doing.
Yeah.
Tolkien criticized the hell out of Lewis's style, as probably exactly as you're saying, a little heavy-handed in the way that he does that. But one way to look at the way he tells his story is that I've heard it said before that Lewis kind of viewed the possibility of conversion doesn't have to happen before death, and that love continues to pursue us after death. Right. And that's kind of what this book promotes is, what if like this isn't just like about a decision that someone made? What if this is about a posture and attitude that one holds for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And that I found to be much more palatable, as I was also wrestling with this idea of hell when I was a young theologian.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, Joel, let's leave people with one final quote from the book that kind of sticks with you to this day.
Well, I have to give this again a little bit of context, because the quote is in context is so powerful, but it's the only vignette where the person coming up from Greytown actually does stay in heaven. It's the only vignette, and every other one, the person in Greytown rejects it. And the story is this person who's wandering around, and he has like this red lizard on his shoulder. And I've always kind of viewed the red lizard to be a little bit like addiction or something of that sort. And it's constantly, and then this huge angel of light confronts them and basically says, "Can I kill the lizard?" And the lizard, "He'll do it, he'll do it, he'll do it." And the man's like, "No, don't worry about it, don't worry." It's just like, I don't want to bother you. And he's like, "Shh, quiet." And he's like, "But don't you want me to kill it?" He's like, "Well, yeah, but it's like, I don't want to, back off. You're really hot. You're hurting me. You're hurting me." And this angel's like, "Can I kill it? I can't do it without your permission," and kind of thing. And he's like, "Well, let me get back on the bus. I'll go down. I'll get the doctor's opinion, and I'll let you know in the moment I hear." And he says, "This moment contains all moments," which I think is a great line. It's just like, yes, the decision you make here is representative of all your decisions. And what ends up happening is he finally just like, "Okay, just do it. Just kill it." And so the angel like grabs the lizard and throws it on the ground, and there's this screech and there's pain. The man comes up and there's tears on his face, but the narrator C.S. Lewis is like, I didn't know if they were tears or if they were just like joy coming off of his face. And then the lizard on the ground slowly begins to transform into a white horse, and it grows up into this gigantic stallion. And the man hops on the horse, and they ride off into the mountains. And so here's the lines. So Lewis says, "Am I right in thinking the lizard really turned into a horse?" And this is, MacDonald replying, "Aye, but it was killed first. You'll not forget that part of the story." "I'll try not to, sir, but does it mean that everything that is in us can go on to the mountains?" "Nothing, not even the best and noblest, can go on as it is now. Nothing, not even what is lowest and bestial, will not be raised again if it submits to death." And what I liked about that is saying that whatever is quote unquote good or bad, noble or ignoble about us, that all of it has remnants of the divine blessing of good and the flawed nature of what the Bible would call sin. And that the spiritual path really is to trust that there's good in all, but there's always a necessity, a call to die to something about even the best of us. And I call that ego. And so to me, I loved, I reframe kind of that passage through my own interpretations now, but I still think it's a beautiful picture.
It's, that moment there was asking if he can kill the lizard. Like, even as I hear that, because now I remember that scene.
Yeah.
But my body feels sort of that sense of urgency, that tension, because with a secular application, that works too, because we have all had those moments in our lives where we know that the thing that we want to start doing or the goal that we want to reach, if we don't make a decision now about doing something, it could even be like, as a guy, the girl in the bar you see, you're like, it's that feeling like, I know I don't have to do this, but if I don't do this now, I'm going to be a weaker person. It doesn't matter how it turns out. Yep. I have to go do that thing because my courage is going to grow or shrivel right now. Yep. I love how he hooks into that. We've all had that moment that's one of the things that does make him a very powerful writer, is he's able to hook into those moments that are completely human universals. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Joel, thanks for putting a lot of effort into sort of recalling and going over the book again.
What do you think of my Scottish accent?
I'd give it a 5 out of 10. I think that you've got some things down, and it's
Wow, solid C minus, Joel.
No, listen, it's got potential. It's definitely, it could grow. It could get better. I think it could also be a lot worse. It's just right in the middle. It's right in the middle.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, any other tidbits before we close out?
None. That,
folks, is another episode, really, of Lead Balloons, focusing on our favorite books. We've now done Four Agreements, Lord of the Rings, The Great Divorce, and who knows what will come next. You're going to have to stay tuned. All right, thanks for joining us. That wraps it up.
Peace, y'all.